Good morning. We're ready again with the life of Padre Pio. Only about 230 pages left to go, so we're really shooting through. This long passage was very beautifully described, the awakening that gradually unfolded during the first 15 years of Pio's life. If he went through a purgation of the self, it was when he was a student or even before. By the time Padre Pio came to live at Pietrelcina as a priest, he seems to have been living at the stage of illumination, despite experiencing a growing sense of spiritual aridity and desolation. The game of love was gradually giving place to an ever-deepening spiritual darkness and agony. By 1915, the dark night phase, or passive purgation, had begun to predominate in his inner life. We will see that it reached its zenith in 1918 and persisted in some sense to the end of his life. By 1944, while Padre Pio was still suffering from his usual trial, Padre Agostino became aware that his friend and protege lived in habitual, intimate union with God. Even as late as 1946, when Pio was 59, Agostino commented that Pio's trial had abated but not disappeared. In fact, it seemed to coexist with the friar's increasing elevation in God. During the years 1912 to 1916, as we have said, Padre Pio was experiencing the illumination of the dark night side by side. Describing his spiritual exaltation, Pio wrote to Agostino on March 16, 1912, "Sometimes I seem to be on the point of dying of a surfeit of sweet joy. And 5 days later," he writes, "only God knows what a sweetness I have experienced yesterday, especially after Mass. If only now, when I still feel almost all of his sweetness, I could bury these consolations within my heart, I would certainly be in paradise. How happy Jesus makes me, how sweet his spirit is. He continues to love me and draw me closer to himself. He has forgotten my sins and remembers only his mercy. Morning by morning, he comes into my poor heart and pours out all the effusions of his goodness." On April 18, 1912, he writes Agostino again, "Oh, how delightful the conversation was that I held this morning with Paradise. Things impossible to translate into human language. The heart of Jesus and my heart were, allow me to use this expression, fused. The joy in me was so intense and so profound that I was able to contain myself no longer, and my face was bathed in the most delightful tears." Further, on July 7, 1913, Pio describes a vision of Christ. "The Lord," he wrote Agostino, "immersed my soul in such peace and contentment that all the sweetest delights of this world, even if they were doubled, pale in comparison to even a drop of his blessedness. Yet these spiritual joys were interspersed with periods of spiritual desolation. Pio's sweetest consolations only increased his desire for God, a desire he knew he could never be consummated in this world. Because of this, he longed for death. Writing to his beloved professor on August 8, 1912, Pio says, "My spirit runs the risk of separating itself from my body because I cannot inadequately love Jesus on earth. I do not adequately love Jesus on earth. Yes, my soul is wounded with love for Jesus. I am sick with love. I continuously experience the bitter pain of the fire that burns, but which does not consume." Again, Pio speaks of his longing to be united with Jesus in heaven. When he writes Agostino a New Year's letter on December 29, 1912, speaking of another year about to lose itself in eternity, movingly he laments, "How many souls more fortunate than I will hail the dawn of the new year, but not the end? How many souls have entered into the house of Jesus, there to remain forever? Life here below is a bitter grief to me, a life of exile that is a torment so bitter to me that I can scarcely bear it. The thought that any moment I could lose Jesus distresses me in an unspeakable way. Describing the occasion when he was in ecstasy and the sacristan thought he was dead, Pio wrote to Agostino, "It seems as if an invisible force were immersing my whole being into fire. My God, what fire! What sweetness! I felt many of those transports of love, and for some time I remained as if out of this world. Had this lasted a moment, nay, a second longer, my soul would have been separated from my body and I would have gone to be with Jesus." In connection with another one of these experiences, he wrote one of his most sublime passages, expressing his yearning to break the bonds of the flesh. "After my poor little soul has sighed for the moment of departure, after it has come several times to the limit of life, after it has relished the sweetness of death, and has suffered all the struggle and torment that comes from nature reclaiming its rights, after my soul has left my body even to the extent of losing sight of this world below, and after I have almost touched the portals of the heavenly Jerusalem in my hand, I reawaken in this place of exile, becoming once more a pilgrim, always capable of being lost, and a new kind of agony seizes me that is worse than death itself, and worse than any kind of martyrdom." Continuing his lament to Agostino, Pio complains, "Alas, dear Father, how terribly hard this mortal life is. As long as it lasts, eternal life is uncertain. O cruel life, enemy of the love that loves us infinitely, more than we can possibly love or understand him. Why do you not come to an end? He longed to enter at once into that eternal rest, where I shall live forever, lost in that immense ocean of good, and enjoying that by which he himself is blessed. Ah, dear Father, when will that long-awaited day come, when my poor little soul will break up like a foundering ship in that immense ocean of eternal truth, where we will no longer be able to sin, or be aware that creatures are endowed with free will, because all miseries are ended, we will no longer be able to withdraw our eyes from the sweetness, from the limitless beauty, nor cease to delight in God in one perpetual ecstasy of sweetest love." Not only was Padre Pio in agony at being separated from God, he was also devastated by his own sinfulness as he perceived it. His letters to Agostino and Benedetto abound with references of his own worthlessness. In May 1914, speaking of the deep darkness thickening on the horizon of my spirit, Pio confesses, "I know that no one is spotless in the sight of the Lord, but my impurity is without bounds before him. In the present state in which the merciful Lord, in his infinite wisdom and justice, condescends to raise the veil and reveal my secret shortcomings to me in all their malignity and hideousness, I see myself so deformed that it seems as if my very clothing shrinks in honor of my defilement." Not only is he horrified by his actual sins, he was filled with terror at his potential to sin. In September 1915, he writes to Agostino that the thoughts of going astray and offending God fills me with terror. It paralyzes my limbs, and both body and soul feel as if they were being squeezed in a powerful vice. My bones feel as if they were being dislocated, crushed and ground up. All this anguish at the mere thought of sinning. Pio once said that the agony his soul experienced during this dark night was so great that he could not conceive of it being much less than the atrocious pains that the damned suffer in hell. Like Luther, who said that he could not endure this utter desolation for 10 minutes and still live, Padre Pio said, "Such torture does not last long, nor could it do so, because if I remain alive at all while it lasts, it is through a signal favor from God." In various letters he speaks of being mad with anguish, not knowing whether he is in hell or purgatory or on earth, of being in an endless desert of darkness, despondency, and insensibility, a land of death and night of abandonment. a cavern of desolation in which my poor soul finds itself far from God and alone with itself. Padre Pio was able to describe and explain this state in a clear and objective way. To Margarita Tresca, a young spiritual daughter who was suffering the same kind of approximately the same time. Pio described her sufferings as a grace ordained by God to exalt your soul to the perfect union of love. He goes on to say that before attaining this union, a Christian needs to be purged of his defects as well as of his attachments to things both natural and supernatural. This is necessary, Pio says, because every natural inclination and mode of behavior must be surrendered to God so as to be transformed to work in another way more divine than human. Padre Pio goes on to explain how God purges the soul, totally emptying it of itself. A self-centeredness must be replaced by a new way of thinking and wishing that is simply and purely supernatural and celestial. In order to arrive at that state, the Christian must be subjected to the painful trial whereby he is purged by an intense light that reveals faults hitherto unseen. He sees God not as a loving Father, but as a terrifying judge. He feels as if God were casting him out. He feels hopelessly lost. It is through this passive purgation that God utters and unites the soul to himself with a chain of love. Yet this process produces a darkness thicker than that which enshrouded the Egyptian at the time of the Exodus. This is because the intellect is incapable of receiving the light and is indisposed by many imperfections and weaknesses. This affects the intellect, the highest powers of the soul, and the physical appetites. That's it for today. We'll take it up tomorrow. Thank you all for listening. Love everyone. I'll see you tomorrow, or you'll see me tomorrow. Bye-bye.